Chris, thank you so much for that kind introduction. When you send a note to us saying that if you have someone in mind who can introduce you, please let me know. Otherwise, as president, I will introduce you. And I thought, who knows me better? And who has been a more expansive influence on my life and work since I was in graduate school? So first of all, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for being an inspiration for so long. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank my guide, Cynthia Humes, and I want to thank Dr. Deepak Shimkata because he got me involved in something I had no business being in, which was becoming president of the Himalayan Arts Council of the Pacific Asian Museum. And the reasons for that are complex. But at that time, I said to myself, if I'm going to talk about this, I need to know about this. So I started taking numerous, I think it ended up being about 8 or 9 courses in the art history of the arts of the Hindu and Buddhist world, at which point I realized the philosophy and theology behind the art is what's really attracting me. And the rest, as they say, is known. So thank you, Dr. Shimkata, and thank you for that wonderful presentation. Thank you, President Chappell, and the board of SASA for this honor, which I don't know why I deserve, because my world revolves around areas that are somewhat different than or additional to the social scientific study of religion. And that is the world of applied philosophy, applied ethics, and applied theology. I consider myself to be a Hindu ecofeminist theologian, and what that will be will come out in my talk. And I thank you for your patience while I do this presentation in honor of my father, who passed away very recently. So I will start with that, and I will start with my journey, because the journey that he placed me on is what brought me here today. Currently, I have the honor of, I have to think now, 15 PhD students and nearly 20 master's students who are my advisees. So I'm advisor to a large cohort of students who are involved in a variety of things, South Asian religions, but also yoga studies, but also sustainability studies, as well as comparative theology. It's a broad field that we work on at the Center for Dharma Studies. All of these students are very dear to me, and I realize that the way I treat them and the way I teach them, my pedagogical, epistemological, hermeneutical, entire framework for thought is coming out of the experience that arose with myself as a child of my father. And so I will start with that, and then I will present my work on ecofeminist and application in relation to the divine feminine. And at that point, I think Dr. Shimkata's and my work will follow us. So permit me to first present without PowerPoint, and then I will present with PowerPoint. If at any time you cannot hear me, please shout out. I won't be able to see you. I'm just pulling up my PowerPoint. Excuse me. Thank you for inviting me and for this exemplar award, which I don't know if that I deserve, but I will share my journey with you, which may be of interest. On a sunny day in late March, a large container ship loaded with cargo set sail for Bremen, Germany, from what was then known as Calcutta. The ocean liner, a merchant vessel owned by an international cargo shipping company, had many ports of call on the way to Germany. On board the ship, amongst the officers, was a young vice president of the German shipping company that owned the vessel, accompanied by his wife and child. His wife had been on many of these trips with him before, but not the child because she was very little, and this was the first time she was old enough to climb on board. The little girl peeked over the rails and peered at the waters of the Bay of Bengal. But first, before that, there was a stop to pick up cargo at Chittagong in Bangladesh, in what is now Bangladesh. And there, her father's friends, the Hussein family, provided warm hospitality to them. The ship sailed on. Muddy at first, the waters turned blue by Chennai and azure by the time the vessel passed the Coromandel coast. The container ship made a port of call at the seaport of Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia, and then sailed on to Mombasa's modern port, built on the site of one of Africa's oldest extant harbors, an economic gateway for Kenya. Every port had a history and a context in that larger region, which was conveyed to the little girl by her father. She was too young to fully comprehend the granularity of what he said. She could sense the significance and the rubric in which his words were placed. Finally, the vessel reached Cape Town, South Africa, and docked for nearly 2 days. At every port of call, her father had colleagues, all of whom he referred to as my good friends, who rarely failed to invite the family for a meal or an overnight visit. And so the touch of Africa moved the girl in so many ways. As for her father, who was familiar with 3 continents, all the world was his home. At Cape Town, he visited a branch office of his firm and received a communication from headquarters. He had 2 offers for executive positions, to his surprise. The young man was in demand due to his experience on 3 continents, his fluency in multiple languages, his efficiency honed through rigorous training in Germany, and his ability to make friends out of just about anyone he met in his capacity. But positions were not in Europe, where he was headed and where he was supposed to spend 6 months and no more. They were in New York and Montreal, respectively. But at that moment, he was alone with his family back on board the ship. And he had to make a spot decision because that afternoon, the ship would sail out into the Atlantic. He chose Canada. As he later explained, he chose Montreal for 1,000 reasons, and they still hold, or they still held when he passed away a few weeks ago. As the warm spring months on the Atlantic, with not a hint of land in sight, the little girl was thrilled to see bits of solid ground, even if they were just rocky outcrops, they would do. Finally, the ship docked in Bremerhaven, one of the largest container ports in the world. This was the destination. Having learned German from her parents and from the two other children on board, Frank and Proke. She ran headlong into the adventure that was Europe decades ago. Children can accept sudden changes and view them as adventures. But her mother, my mother, on the other hand, was uneasy because we had left a world behind. Not for a year, not for 6 months, but forever. Family, friends, culture, country, and a home carefully tended, designed, furnished, and loved to help bring back that sense of adventure to his beloved wife. My father arranged many holidays in Belgium, Holland, and other parts of Europe. And the history, art, and architecture made an abiding impression on his child's mind. After 5 months, we set sail again, this time for our new life in French Canada. A transatlantic voyage across the North Atlantic in autumn was a wild experience with gale, high seas, and the lurching tempo of the vessel as the constant drumbeat of the winds became an accompanying percussion. Montreal was exquisite when we reached. In the twilight, with magenta skies over a luminous, bejeweled Mount Royal. We docked in the harbor, which would be the focus of my father's professional world for decades on. There in the heart of this beautiful city, we moved into a tiny apartment. The refined and graceful woman, beautiful and brave, who was my mother, was used to the privileged life, the wife of a senior executive in India. She found herself, or rather, I found her, hauling groceries up the hilly avenues to her tiny apartment with her lovely silk saris trailing in the muddy snow. This wouldn't do, she felt. Known for her intrepid nature, she phoned around and found a job. Armed only with her mastery of English and her degree in English, in the midst of a French city and a French province, she rode the public transport on the frozen Montreal roads. She willed herself into a transformed state and became a professional woman, a rare breed at that time. From nannies and chauffeurs and the constant attention of her mother, the child became a latchkey kid with a precious key around her neck and the terror of missing the bus in her heart. Her joy, though, lay in the affection of her new friends, mostly in Westmount, North African and Middle Eastern, Jewish and Muslim girls and boys, whose French-speaking professional fathers come to Montreal for greater opportunity. The mother of one of her new best friend, Siada Gawad, an Egyptian girl, would often invite her to their home. Was in the midst of immigrant children, not of her heritage, not of her ancestral land, not of her religious world or her cultural background, that she found a new identity. The distinctions of Hindu and Muslim faded from her memory. Her friends, like her, were all visible minorities, trying to become Canadian. In a few years, their task, though, would become a bit easier as English Canada desperately courted the immigrants of French Canada in face of Quebec's separatist urges. By the time we were in high school, we became bona fide English Canadians after the Front de Libération de Québec, FLQ. Separatist domestic terrorists kidnapped and murdered Pierre Laporte, the deputy premier of the province of Quebec during the October crisis. Going back to that tiny apartment in Westmount, well before this, after a year of extraordinary hard work, the parents of the little girl that was me in another life brought a home. They bought a home in the western part of Montreal Island, where the land was cheap and new homes were plentiful, and the identity was Anglophone. Visible minority status disappeared, and I became Anglophone. They found themselves with an acre lot and plenty of work to do. Over the course of time, I helped my father with an ever-expanding garden, always interested in the natural world. He became knowledgeable about the native species of trees and flowering plants. And there were exciting forays into the surrounding forests to find wild strawberries, apples, and edible mushrooms, to identify small saplings that would grow well in the home's garden. Wild roses were found and planted, heirloom fruit and other native produce were nurtured, and new identity now emerged, one based on terrain. My father showed me the forest ponds that were full of life and the little critters that scattered as we approached. A new identity based on the love of the land. An eco-identity emerged and continued and continues to inform my life and work. Through all these adventures, estrangement from my heritage tore at me, while exhilaration at constant new discoveries expanded my horizons. The search for a self evoked deep journeys of the mind that sought to understand the source of civilizations and to learn the meaning of being human in a world where identity was very hard to come by. The quest was intensive, and much to my teachers' and mentors' delight, they found a student thirsty for more resources, more information, more knowledge, and more assignment, much to their delight. In this quest for meaning, the photos on my nightstand, which had been there since the start of the ocean voyage from what is now known as Kolkata, were now emblematic of my grandfather who had bestowed them. The images were of a spiritual teacher, Mira Al-Fasa, the mother of Pondicherry, a Jewish Algerian woman who became the most important guru in India at that time. And of course, her teacher, Sri Aurobindo. They had been talismans, these photos, across the oceans and through the unfolding of a new life. But now they were much more. They were the pathway to meaning, the road to an abiding identity. When other children received storybooks, my father presented his daughter with encyclopedias, an entire collection of the classics of Western literature. When my friends were receiving Mad magazines, he ordered The Economist. But I was on a quest for an identity that could not be lost on transoceanic journeys or to the constant movements of lives being rebuilt. Encyclopedias and other books were indispensable sources of the compendium building in my mind, of the foundation on which Aurobindo could build the structure to hold what he experienced as new revelatory knowledge. Those foundations of philosophy and philosophical theology, foundational information on the darshanas, Upanishads, the major schools of Vedanta, Bhashyas, were systematized and placed in dialogue with Plato and handed in to my chair of the history department and my mentor. She published it and gave it to our high school librarian. The librarian placed it in every high school library in the West Island. as she was on the library board. They encouraged me to continue on the dialogical work I did. At the time of graduation as a valedictorian, I acknowledged the gift of my beloved mentors who encouraged the child without an identity, the child without a sense of self, to reclaim agency and elicit inner authority, to create a sense of self that was still interconnected and embedded with the broader world. More importantly, he encouraged us the self that could have been fractured by the dissonance of diaspora life, to have conviction in the value of the knowledge embedded in one's own lived experience. This dialogical world has pulled me ever more broadly into a quest for connection, interrelatedness, interwovenness, but also ever more deeply into a search for epistemic reclamation, a tradition, a civilization, a spiritual culture, or a cosmovision cannot survive as a living stream without constant recovery and re-envision. That cannot happen if the entity is denied existence, denied identity. To elicit our very best work, our highest creativity, it is necessary to allow the voice to define itself rather than being defined. Place this work in fruitful dialogue with the other, not only the religious, ethnic, gendered, cultural, racial other, but the interdisciplinary other, the sectoral other. Such work, to be fruitful, must be forged in the crucible of epistemic justice. When a gender, a community, a race, a class, or a group of people are denied the validity of their lived experience, we see epistemic injustice. This is the disastrous denial of their embodied experience as beings. Bud Hall and Rajesh Tandon, who are co-holders of the UNESCO Chair in Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education at the University of Victoria, Canada, have made the observation, based on decades of collaborative work on the knowledge democracy, that suggests, I quote, that higher education institutions today are working with a very small part of the extensive and diverse knowledge systems in the world. Following from Suso Santos, they illustrate how hegemonic knowledge has been engaged in epistemicide, or the killing of other knowledge systems. It is now necessary to render visible the excluded knowledges of our remarkable planet. Knowledge stories, theoretical dimensions of knowledge, democracy, and the evolution of community-based participatory research partnerships is what is needed, according to them. And UNESCO agrees. In order to elicit speech from silenced voices, to render visible occluded visions, their existence and identity needs to be acknowledged. This includes, in particular, voices from the global South, which many of you have so eminently supported, which have experienced colonization or enslavement and epistemicide on a grand scale. But epistemic justice and recovery also includes disciplinary identity, epistemologies that arise from transformational power of narratives, from embodied contemplative practices, from sacred sound, from emotive elucidation, the creativity of sacred imagination. All of these are epistemic sources. that give rise not only to knowing, but to sensing, feeling, and acting in ways that decenter the radical individualism of late mercantile neoliberals. Also diminished and denied are the epistemic resources found in religious philosophy, in theology, in contemplative theory and praxis, and in narrative ethics. In other words, in my field of environmental humanities, the moral and spiritual dimension of being human is often forgotten. But 81% of humanity is affiliated with something called a religion or spiritual tradition. We are facing the possibility of the extinction of human civilization, not to speak of the life support systems of the earth. We need all hands on deck. As I've written in our recent 35 chapter edited volume released by Springer Nature under the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals series, which we edited together, Dr. Billimuri and I. I'm citing this from my chapter. The devastation of the ecosphere is inextricably linked to unsustainable economic, ecological, societal, geopolitical, cultural, and ethical perspectives. The global pandemic, climate calamity, the sixth mass extinction, degradation of much of the Earth's ecosystemic network, and the toxicity of global water, air, and soil are diverse facets of a single cause: the extreme malrelationship, the denial of interrelationship between human civilization and the ecosystems of our planet. Existence itself is in the process of being reduced to the point where commerce and consumption intersect. The ability of the human imagination creatively absorb and be informed by wilderness, sentience, and the cosmos is diminishing daily. This diminution is evident in the rendition of the arts and the humanities as increasingly irrelevant. To enable the restoration and flourishing of human communities and the ecosystems of the biosphere, more and newer technology will be helpful but inadequate. More and better data will be helpful but inadequate, because numerical computations forecasting disaster have been shown to be insufficient, to say the least, in the face of human denial and recalcitrance. Societies need to be reimagined and restored in ways that acknowledge the significance of the moral, ethical, aesthetic, and spiritual dimensions of human experience. The epistemic paradigms based on radical commercialism, which have led to catastrophic climate change, zoonosis, the ravaging of the Earth's life support systems, are not likely to lead to the healing of the same. New imaginaries need to arise that can elicit wonder and reverence, needed to inspire care. Humility and gratitude in the face of the majestic mystery of creation is a shared element across diverse religious traditions. Religion, philosophy, and theological thought and theoethics are increasingly associated today with anti-scientific, anti-emancipatory, and unjust attitudes and actions. Yet, I warn you that such blanket condemnations fail to understand that the virulent edge of radicalized religion is absolutely not its full spectrum. The fostering of the values of care and compassion, of altruism for kin and community, careful observation of wild and cultivated spaces, all of these are normative aims in many religious traditions, as is the contemplative life which forces us to seek within for that which will satisfy our needs. And the arts and aesthetics of all of these traditions have value and power. These aims continue to move individuals to transcend narrow self-interest and to see themselves as beings in a communitarian world, in a relational world. Whether such embedded resources translate into ecologically conscious action is dependent on theoethical interpretation. That is the work my colleagues and I do. Across traditions, we see ever-widening development of ecological theology and the theoethics of the earth. You have, I'm sure, heard of Laudato Si by Pope Francis, but there are many other, and I had the privilege of giving a Hindu response to that wonderful encyclical. But there are many other religious teachers I have met across traditions, and in my own tradition, numberless such teachers who are filled with new visions to re-enchant and restory the cosmos and the human place in the planetary order, new paradigms for ethical and existential aims that can inspire the will and enhance the imagination, are able to emerge out of these contemplative worlds. Without transformed vision that compels consistent alterations in human values and behaviors, new information on the threats posed by climate change or the evidence of even biogeophysical disruptions caused by wholesale, unrestricted resource extraction, all of this will remain unacknowledged by selfish interests. The vast majority of the global publics that the UN environmental program speaks about as necessary for buying in to the SDGs, the UN SDGs, are deeply embedded in networks of theological vision and sacred praxis and their interconnected impacts on cultures. While tradition religious affiliations are, of course, diminishing in Western Europe and North America, it is increasing and diversifying in nations and regions with large populations that will significantly impact the fate of the ecosphere. Yet, while religious thought and practice is so often rightly critiqued for policies and practices against the flourishing of humans and ecosystems, the recognition that religion, at the same time, simultaneously, holds one of the master keys to unlock the moral, altruistic, and compassionate urge within human nature is still not well recognized outside the circles of contemplative eco-theological reflection. Planetary survival is now predicated upon the alignment of our notion of both human and environmental and ecological rights with our combined highest principles. As such, ways of knowing, epistemologies that are embedded in religion, philosophy, spiritual ethics, moral traditions, and a culture that values the commons are indispensable as essential resources for the transformation necessary for environmental resilience, ecological regeneration, and planetary renewal. Sustainable nature requires sustainable society, not wounded ones. And of course, there is nothing called humanity and nature. There's only nature, and we are part of it. I want to, at this point, give my thanks and gratitude to my late mentor, Rosemary Radford Ruther. Rosemary Ruther was an ecofeminist theologian of her own tradition, Catholic. But she brought women of the global South, women of different religions, women from different cultures into an intercultural community of scholars and practitioners and activists who spoke to their own tradition and to each other about the linked oppressions that make the environmental degradation of our earth possible. And that philosophy, ecofeminism, was the first intersectional philosophy to actually recognize this link. So now I will request your patience while I bring forth my PowerPoint on this world, the world of ecofeminist philosophy and theology that has been my practice since graduate school. To that, I owe so much gratitude to Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and other women, and Hindu women, ecofeminist theologians. But let us first talk about why this is significant and what could it possibly mean. I will now share. Chris, can you enable sharing?
It should just work. With Deepak, you just simply did, there you
I
go.
got it. Thank you.
And a few more minutes.
Yes. Excuse me for a moment. Chris, can you let me know the time that I have? You're muted.
Yes, 7 minutes.
Okay. I will go fast. So let me just why this is happening, but maybe it's because I have so little time. I will not have time to talk to you about ecofeminism in detail. So let me just say this. For Rosemary Ruther, mind or consciousness in ecofeminist thought is not something that originates in some transcendent world outside of nature, but in the place where nature itself becomes conscious, a perspective which reflects an integration of mind consciousness with nature embodiment would give rise to a genuine theology of immanence. Ecofeminist spirituality tends to envision the divine, not as ruler, nor as a removed and distant higher reality, but as the eminent community. Ruther. As a theology of radical divine immanence, which is the name of my forthcoming volume, by that I mean organic immanence. It is not a term that can be used in any theology that is not a transformation of matter by the divine, through the divine. As a theology of radical divine immanence, Hindu Shakta Tantra and Shakta theology offers a philosophical structure that can form the foundations of Hindu ecofeminist spirituality. This paper that I am citing from attempts to explore certain life-affirming tenets of Shakta Tantra, juxtaposing them against aspects of traditional Hindu thought that tend to devalue materiality and hence the natural world. I'd like to make it clear at the outset that I'm not suggesting that Shakta theology or Shakta Tantra provides the only spiritual answer. I am unable to speak at the moment because of the sound that's coming from someone's I'm not saying that this is the only life-affirming tenet, but that anything that devalues materiality and hence the natural world is problematic. I cannot speak because I'm unable to put their souls on mute. The idea of sacred immanence, the affirmation of the force and presence of the supreme reality in every dimension of the manifest universe, is powerfully expressed in Shakta theology is the hallmark of Shaktism. Models of the divine feminine, represented by Shakta strains in Hindu theology, expand the roles of the divine feminine and associate the feminine principle with transcendence as well as immanence. It is, however, an emphasis on the sacred nature of this world and the valorization of sentience, embodiment, and elemental nature on earth that especially distinguishes Shakta theology. Here you see the vast river Ganga envisioned as a life-giving facet of the divine feminine. And what we have here is that the vision of the earth as a sacred hierophany and a material form of the divine is most dramatically displayed in goddess theology, first crystallized in early and medieval narrative philosophical theology. This vision finds expression and culminates in the sophisticated systematization of the nature and functions of Shakti, the highest feminine principles in the Tantric and Shakta traditions. The Shakta strains of the theology offer the rich and nuanced resource for construction of an ecologically conscious spirituality. It's not only the ontology of Hindu Tantra as a viable source of inspiration for the development of an ecofeminist theological vision, Tantra's perception that purity sattva lies inherent in every person, regardless of the hierarchy of birth, class, ethnicity, culture, region, gender, is groundbreaking for women and others whose voices have been silenced, and women have been leaders in Tantra, Shakta Tantra, for over a millennia. Tantra women adepts are shown as fierce, wild, and free. They are presented in the wilderness, in the forests, in the mountains, and other places in the more than human world. The natural world is integral to Tantric spiritual practice. I will move into, just going to skip all this and move directly into the last part. This is about praxis, eco-praxis from Shakta Tantra. But what I'm just going to talk about for this time is the theology of the divine feminine. What does it matter in terms of this work? And to go through some of the basic core values. The Devi Mahatmya is a delightful text with an exciting narrative structure with which Dr. Shankara showed us. But underlying the structure, the narrative structure, is the theological core of the Devi Mahatmyam, which includes various theological hymns, including the Devi Sukta of the Rig Veda, and adding that first she integrates the philosophical masculine principle and feminine principle and the complex binaries that they represent. She incorporates all other feminine divinities in her being, along with their masculine counterparts, binaries. The Devi further is proclaimed to be eternal, first cause, efficient and material, ultimate reality, supreme truth, being, consciousness, and creation itself, all of which equate her to Brahman and the formless absolute. As Shakti, she is the power and will that forces creation, that moves and lures creation into being, manifests herself through and within creation as matter, energy, and consciousness, and is the gnosis, that is subtle awareness pervading consciousness. From the Devi Mahatmya, these are all the verses that really matter here. The nature of supreme divinity is the foundation of ecological theology and ecofeminist theology, and the spirituality and practices that arise from that. And here, the nature of supreme divinity is the goddess in the Devi Mahatmya. She's the creator of the universe, the very process of temporality, the change within it, all pervasive and eternal, cause of the cosmic creation, maintenance and dissolution. She is at once the gnosis that liberates and the illusory nature of that experiential knowledge. While she's the divine redemptress for those seeking liberation, she's a source of fulfillment for those seeking worldly satisfaction. Because in Shakti theology, it's not just the divine as your consciousness or as the inner witness or as the higher self. She is also the body-mind, the field in which consciousness expands and does its work. And therefore, the body-mind itself is divine. And that divinity sacralizes the embodied experience of oppressed peoples everywhere and oppressed species everywhere. She's identified with the primary modes of the feminine principles, such as Maya, for these philosophical principles of Maya, Prakriti, the inner characteristic of the gunas, all of this coming from Sankhya philosophy of luminous purity, sattva, dynamic activity, rajas, and dissolutive of entropic states that weave through and condition all of matter. All three are necessary. But at the same time, she's the self-existent eternal divinity. She's characterized as both tremendous and awe-inspiring in her power and the epitome of gentleness. Within all life, she resides as consciousness, intelligence, power, activity, perception, and compassion. As the supreme reality, she's omnipresent, all-pervasive divine immanence in the material universe, comprising all forms which are her transformation, not merely self of all forms, the embodiment of all forms. She's the divine source. And the last hymn speaks of that. So I conclude, actually I wanted to conclude not with my two books. These are the two books that have recently come out and they're related. Because we're looking at contemplative studies as a source and as a resource for religion and sustainability. So I'm going to leave you with 31 seconds of my latest documentary.
Stop right now and let me ask you this. How is it possible that Elon Musk can manage?
When you go in, Rita, you need to make certain to maximize for both video and audio.
Are embedded and part
Can you
of
hear?
the natural world.
Are you able to hear?
Rewilding can be understood as a returning to ancestral ways.
Yes.
The road towards being and becoming. The environment is our relationships, the food we grow, the housing and the policies that affect us. There is no humanity and nature. There's only nature, and we are part of it.
Thank you for attending tonight's event at the Graduate Theological Union.